It was supposed to be a fun getaway, just 4 of us. Me, my best friend Mark, his girlfriend Rachel, and my roommate Dave, driving across the country before life pulled us in different directions. We had planned to take our time, stopping wherever looked interesting, eating at roadside diners, and staying in cheap motels along the way. On our 4th night, somewhere in Arizona, we found ourselves on a long, empty stretch of highway. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. The road was eerily silent, stretching endlessly in both directions with no sign of another vehicle for miles. The occasional cactus and scrub bushes were the only things breaking the monotony of the barren land. Then we saw it, the flickering neon sign of a motel just off the road. It seemed like the perfect place to crash. It was a rundown, single-story building, its white paint peeling and stained with years of desert dust. The parking lot was cracked, littered with stray pieces of trash that rustled slightly in the evening breeze. Only a few cars were scattered around, their presence oddly unsettling rather than reassuring. The sign read Sunset Haven Motel, though half the letters had burned out, leaving an eerie glow that barely illuminated the front office. A buzzing street lamp near the entrance flickered intermittently, casting jittery shadows across the cracked pavement. Beyond the motel, the landscape was pitch black, an abyss of desert stretching into nothingness. The lack of movement, the absence of sound, it felt like the kind of place where time stood still. "We sure about this?" Rachel asked, gripping her phone tightly as Mark pulled into the lot. "We just need a place to sleep," Mark said, forcing a grin. "One night, we'll be fine. I wish we had kept driving." Inside the lobby, a man in his 60s sat behind the counter. He had a thin, wrinkled face, deep-set eyes, and the kind of expression that made you feel unwelcome before you even spoke. "2 rooms," Mark said, pulling out his wallet. "Just for the night." The old man didn't say much. He took the cash, handed us 2 keys, and muttered, "Rooms 12 and 14, around the back." As we turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Lock your doors." His tone sent a small shiver down my spine. Our rooms were next to each other, separated by a thin wall. Mark and Rachel took room 12, while Dave and I took 14. The rooms were what you'd expect: outdated furniture, a small TV, a bed that looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. I was too tired to care. I dropped my bag, used the bathroom, and was about to lie down when I heard Dave say, "Hey, come look at this." He was at the window, peeking through the blinds. I walked over and followed his gaze. A man stood near the edge of the parking lot, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just watching the motel. "Maybe he's just a guest," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Dave nodded, but neither of us could shake the unease settling over the room. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound at the door. I held my breath. My mind raced. Maybe it was just the wind. Then the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, nudging Dave awake. "Someone's at the door." His eyes widened. He reached for his phone, but there was no service. Of course. The rattling stopped. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, from the wall separating us from Mark and Rachel, we heard a muffled thud. A second later, Rachel screamed. Dave and I jumped up, sprinting out the door, just as Mark yanked theirs open from the inside. His face was pale, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Someone tried to open our window," he said. Rachel was shaking, pointing at the glass. The curtain was pulled back slightly, just enough for someone to have stood there watching. "We need to go," I said, my voice urgent. Mark nodded. We grabbed our bags and ran to the car. But when we got outside, the man from the parking lot was gone. As we loaded our things, Dave whispered, "Look." At the far end of the motel, under the flickering neon light, stood a man in a hooded sweatshirt. He wasn't moving, wasn't walking toward us, just standing there. Then he started walking, not running, not charging, just a slow, deliberate pace, heading straight for us. "Get in the car," I hissed. We jumped in, Mark slamming his foot on the gas. As we sped out of the lot, I turned back. The man had stopped. He stood there, watching us leave. We drove for an hour before stopping at a well-lit gas station. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" None of us had an answer. Later, I searched for information about Sunset Haven Motel. There were only a handful of mentions, old travel forums with brief reviews. Most described it as creepy or unsettling, and one even claimed, if you stay there, don't sleep, just keep driving. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the motel just to see if anyone would answer. A man picked up on the third ring. Sunset Haven. His voice was deep, emotionless. I hesitated. Hi. My friends and I stayed there a few nights ago. Something weird happened. Silence. Then the man chuckled, low and humorless. You got lucky, he said and hung up. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, who those men were, what they wanted. But I know one thing, we were never supposed to be there. Three years ago, I was on a solo road trip, driving from Chicago to Phoenix. It wasn't my first long-haul drive, but it was the first time I had decided to take my time, stopping wherever I felt like. That night, somewhere in New Mexico, exhaustion hit me like a brick. I needed to rest, just for a few hours. The glowing neon sign of an old roadside motel appeared like a mirage. Desert Haven Inn, an ironic name considering how desolate it looked. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few trucks, the vacancy sign buzzing weakly in the humid night air. I hesitated, but ultimately pulled in. I was too tired to be picky. Inside, the lobby smelled like stale smoke and cheap air freshener. A man with sun-worn skin and a blank expression sat behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. One night, I said, sliding my credit card across the counter. He barely looked up as he handed me the key. Room 109, around the back, parked close to the door. Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. I was too tired to care. Room 109 was exactly what I expected. Outdated decor, yellowed wallpaper, and a bed that looked like it had been there since the 80s. But I didn't need luxury, I just needed sleep. I locked the door, bolted it, and set my bag on the chair. The air conditioner hummed weakly, barely making a dent in the heat. I took a quick shower, checked my phone, no service, and crawled into bed. Then came the first sound. A faint tap, tap, tap at the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I waited, straining to listen. Nothing. Maybe it was the wind, a tree branch tapping against the glass. I told myself to ignore it, until I heard footsteps. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. A man stood in the parking lot. Not near my car, not near another room, just standing there, staring at my door. My stomach knotted. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, his face obscured in the dim motel lights. He wasn't moving, wasn't smoking, wasn't looking at a phone, just watching. I stepped back, heart hammering. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe I was overreacting. But every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. I double-checked the locks, grabbed my phone, still no service. Great. I thought about going to the front desk, but the idea of stepping outside, of walking past that man, sent a chill through me. Then, a knock on the door. I stopped breathing. The knock came again, louder this time. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone, debating whether to yell out. But something told me, don't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. But I wasn't relieved, because then I heard it. The sound of a key sliding into the lock. I lunged forward and threw the deadbolt just as the handle jerked down violently. Whoever was outside wasn't just checking doors, they had a key. My vision blurred with panic as I grabbed my bag, searching for something, anything, I could use as a weapon. The handle rattled again, harder this time, followed by a frustrated grunt, then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating down the walkway. I waited, 5 minutes, 10. Then, slowly, I crept to the window. The man was gone. I didn't waste time. I threw on my shoes, grabbed my bag, and ran for my car. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the neon motel sign flickering weakly. As I reached my car, I glanced at the front desk window. The man behind the counter was gone. A chill crawled up my spine. I had the sinking realization that whoever tried to get into my room had access to the motel's keys. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot, gravel spitting under my tires. I didn't stop driving for 2 hours. The next day, I called the police. They checked the motel but found nothing. No record of my stay, no clerk matching the description I gave. The motel had been shut down 2 years ago. I still don't know who that man was or how he had a key to my room. But I do know one thing. I'll never stop at a roadside motel again. This happened in 2022. It was my third day on the road. I had started in Seattle, heading east for a new job in Chicago. The drive had been uneventful. Long stretches of highway, occasional gas stops, and greasy diner food. I had planned to stop in a larger town that night, but after nearly 15 hours of driving, I couldn't go any further. Then I saw the sign. Westfield Motel, vacancy. It was an old, single-story building with flickering neon letters that hummed faintly in the darkness. The parking lot was cracked and uneven, with weeds growing through the pavement. A few cars were scattered around, all covered in a thin layer of dust, as if they had been there for days or even weeks. The entire place felt abandoned, yet somehow occupied. The building itself had peeling paint and darkened windows, the kind that made it impossible to tell if anyone was actually inside. The only visible light came from the office window, casting a dim yellow glow onto the pavement. A buzzing fluorescent bulb flickered erratically over the entrance, making the shadows around the building shift in an unsettling way. Something about it felt wrong. The stillness, the eerie silence, the way the wind barely stirred, as if the place existed in a vacuum, untouched by time. But exhaustion overruled my unease. I pulled into the lot, convincing myself I just needed a few hours of sleep. The moment I walked into the office, I felt it. The motel owner, a tall, wiry man with sunken eyes and deep lines on his face, was watching me too intently. He barely blinked as I approached the counter. "Room for the night?" His voice was dry, almost raspy. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just one night." He slid a register toward me. "Name? License plate number?" I hesitated. Most motels didn't ask for that anymore, but I wrote it down. As he reached for the key, his fingers hovered over the rack before he selected one slowly, deliberately. "Room 8, around the side." I nodded and took the key, but as I turned to leave, he spoke again. "You alone?" A cold chill ran down my spine. Why would he ask that? "Yeah," I lied. He grunted and gave a small, knowing smile. "Sleep well?" Room 8 was exactly what I expected. Outdated carpet, a stale smell, a buzzing fluorescent light. I locked the door behind me and tossed my bag on the bed. Then I checked the window. It faced the parking lot, and through the thin curtains, I could see the office window. The owner was standing there. He was watching my room. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly pulled the curtains shut, my pulse racing. Maybe he was just checking the lot. Maybe I was imagining things. Then came the first knock, a light tap at the door. I froze. It was nearly midnight. No one should be knocking. My hand hovered over my phone. Should I call someone? Who? The police? Tell them what? That the motel owner was creepy? Another knock, this time louder. I forced myself to move toward the peephole. No one was there. I waited, held my breath. Then I heard footsteps outside my window. I rushed to the curtains and carefully peeled back the corner. The owner was standing just outside my window, staring at my door. My stomach twisted. He wasn't trying to be discreet, he wanted me to see him. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. Before I could press call, I heard it. The soft, metallic click of a key turning in my lock. I lunged for the door, twisting the deadbolt just as the handle jerked downward. "Sir, this is 911. What is your emergency?" I whispered frantically into the phone, explaining everything in a hushed, panicked voice. Then, silence. The handle stopped moving. A slow, heavy exhale came from the other side of the door. Then, the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. The police arrived in 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. By the time they got there, the owner was back in the office, acting as if nothing had happened. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, shaking his head. "Thought the guest needed something." The officer glanced at me. "You want to press charges?" I looked at the man's face, the smug, unreadable expression. I shook my head. "I just want to leave." I left that night. Drove 3 hours until I found another motel, a real one, in a city with people around. The next day, as I drove toward my destination, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The experience at that motel had left me rattled, and I knew I had narrowly escaped something far worse. I realized then that exhaustion had made me careless. I had ignored my instincts, dismissed the red flags, and put myself in a dangerous situation. simply because I didn't want to push through the fatigue. From that night on, I made a promise to myself. Never ignore that gut feeling again. No matter how tired I am, no matter how desperate I feel, I will always listen to that instinct, the one that tells me when something is wrong. Because that night, it saved my life. I never thought a simple stop at a roadside motel would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was supposed to be just one night, just a few hours of rest before getting back on the road. But instead, I found myself trapped in a nightmare, one I barely escaped. I had been on the road for nearly 12 hours, driving from Denver to Los Angeles. My eyes burned from exhaustion, and the caffeine from my third gas station coffee had worn off. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a dark ribbon cutting through the desert with no sign of civilization for miles. The radio was static, my phone's signal was gone, and the only light came from my headlights slicing through the darkness. Then, in the distance, I saw the flickering glow of a neon sign. Clearview Motel, vacancy. The building stood alone against the vast emptiness of the desert, a relic of another time. The paint on the exterior was cracked and peeling, and the roof sagged slightly, as if the structure itself was growing tired of standing. The parking lot was half full, mostly with dusty, older cars and a couple of large trucks that looked like they hadn't moved in days. The buzzing vacancy sign flickered unevenly, casting erratic shadows across the cracked pavement. I pulled into the lot, the tires crunching against loose gravel. The air outside was thick with the scent of hot asphalt and the faint metallic tang of something I couldn't quite place. The night was eerily still, aside from the distant hum of crickets, as if the world around the motel was holding its breath. I walked into the lobby, the glass door creaking slightly as I pushed it open. The lighting inside was dim, casting a sickly yellow hue over the faded carpet and outdated furniture. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man in a faded plaid shirt, his name tag barely legible, Gary. He didn't greet me, didn't even look up right away. When he did, his eyes were dull, unreadable. "Just need a room for the night?" he asked, his voice flat, disinterested. "Yeah," I said, sliding my credit card across the counter. He ran it without a word, then handed me a key. "Room 12, down to the left." As I turned to leave, I hesitated. Something about the way he was staring, not quite at me, but through me, sent a cold prickle down my spine. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Gary blinked once, slowly, before shaking his head. "Just a long night. Sleep well." His tone was off, too flat, too emotionless. But I was too tired to question it. I took the key and walked toward my room, forcing myself to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling under my skin. The hallway leading to my room smelled of stale air and cheap disinfectant. The dim yellow bulbs cast long shadows, making the already narrow corridor feel even more claustrophobic. I reached room 12, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was basic. A queen-sized bed, a wooden nightstand with an old-fashioned lamp, and a small TV mounted on the wall. The carpet was dark brown and threadbare in places, and the air carried a faint mustiness, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. I locked the door, bolted it, and checked the window. The curtains were thin, barely covering the glass. Through the gap, I could see the parking lot, where a single streetlight illuminated the rows of cars. Everything seemed normal. I took a quick shower, changed into a fresh t-shirt, and collapsed onto the bed. The mattress was stiff, but at that point, I didn't care. I just needed sleep. Then came the first sound, a faint knock, knock, knock at the door. At first, I thought I had imagined it. My body was too exhausted to react. Then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, my pulse quickening. Who the hell would be knocking at my door this late? I glanced at the clock. 1:47 a.m. For a few seconds, I just sat there, listening. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then, from outside the door, a voice, low, almost a whisper. "Hey, I think you dropped something." My stomach twisted. I hadn't dropped anything. I stayed silent, my mind racing. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong room. Then the handle jiggled. I jumped out of bed, my heart hammering. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi icon showed a connection, but when I tried to load anything, nothing worked. The knocking came again, harder this time. Then, footsteps. I crept to the window, carefully pulling the curtain back just an inch. A man stood in the parking lot, directly across from my room. He was dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, the hood pulled up to obscure his face. His posture was stiff, unnatural, and he was staring right at my window. Cold fear gripped my chest. Then I heard something worse, the sound of a key sliding into the lock. I lunged for the door and threw the deadbolt just as the knob twisted violently. A heavy silence followed. Then a deep exhale from the other side of the door. A voice, barely above a whisper. "Come on. Open up." I backed away, searching the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The only thing within reach was the lamp. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white. Then the footsteps retreated, slowly, deliberately. I didn't relax. I stood there, frozen, my breath shallow. A minute passed, then two, then a loud bang against the window. I stumbled back, my heart nearly stopping. But when I looked, the man was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and sprinted to my car. The lot was eerily quiet. The motel office was dark, even Gary was gone. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot. My tires screeched as I hit the road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. But there was no one behind me. I drove for 2 hours straight before stopping at a gas station. Inside, I asked the attendant about Clearview Motel. He gave me a confused look. "You sure about that name?" I nodded. He shook his head. "There's no motel around here by that name." I pulled out my phone, but when I checked my call log, my booking confirmation, everything, it was all gone. Like it had never existed. I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know who that man was or how he had a key to my room. But I do know this. I'll never stay in a roadside motel again. And if I ever see a neon sign flickering in the distance, offering me a place to rest for the night, I'll keep driving.